It's been a while since we have just casually covered a piece of lore that Riot released. That was during the simpler times before Arcane. But now that everything calmed down, we can finally go back and start covering some of the stories that Riot released. With the one we are going to cover today being quite special. Because you see, during the previous years, the stories leading up to the end of the year may be tied to the season launch cinematic. As an example, during the Warriors cinematic, Urgot's appearance was teased in Vi's story. There we learned what was happening to Urgot months before the cinematic. And similarly, Sylas being in the Freljord was also teased in its own separate story. Meaning that the stories we are getting now may be teasing what will appear in the next cinematic. Connected to that, Monstrous E on Twitter datamined a new ward, which looks like Ornn, which may have a similar source to Ryze's ward, which was also tied to a cinematic. So because Ornn is coming to the surface out of nowhere, it is likely that we may get him in a cinematic. And as you'll see in this story, that's why it is important to cover it now. So without further ado, let's go back to our roots and let's cover the newest story about Sejuani called Dead of Winter. The story begins with Sejuani and the Winter's Claw fighting a mammoth. The beast was dying, but like everything in the Freljord, it still fought with every fiber of its being. Its furious bellows shook the mountainside, and Sejuani kept glancing to the side, at the mountain covered in crimson thunderstorm, fearful of an avalanche, or something far worse. The Winter's Claw hunters had stalked the mammoth for a week. There were 10 at first, now only 7 remained. 3 less mouths to feed. Sejuani hated thinking that way, but their seer called Viljalmer predicted the harshest winter in living memory. And the Winter's Claw supplies of food were dwindling fast. The herds of Elnuk were taken by the Avarosans to the south, and the fish in the Ice Sea were frozen below thick ice. This mammoth was their only option. It would feed them all for a week. Sejuani took off her scarf to feel the cold slap her in the face. She looked to her side and saw Urkath, one of her hunters who was entirely wrapped in furs. She could only see his bloodshot eyes through a leather mask in the shape of a roaring bear. The mammoth was slowly walking toward the thundering mountain, but it lost too much blood. Sejuani knew it wouldn't make it far before the beast turned to fight them. Urkath wasn't sure if it was wise to follow it though. If they continued any higher, they would cross into the realm of He Who Stands. Just the faintest thought of the Volibear and the Ursine flooded Sejuani's mouth with the taste of warm blood and lightning in her veins. Of course, this is because in Sejuani's previous story, she got to face the Ursine together with Udyr, and that's when the memories of that story started flashing in her mind. Fangs and claws ripping flesh from the bone, elongated skulls with cold blue fire burning in empty eye sockets. A pact, and a living city reduced to the blackened skeletons of stone and timber. Slaughtered corpses hung from the withered branches of death-nourished trees. Urkath asked her if she was alright. Sejuani wanted to answer, but she couldn't. It felt as if some ancient primal part of her soul overtook her body. The part that once ran with beasts. Knees and palms bloody, skin raw and bare, caked in mud. Urkath shouted at her more urgently. In response, Sejuani's mouth started watering, her lips pulled back to reveal sharp teeth, ready to tear his throat out. She closed her fist on the spiked pommel of her saddle hard. The pain cleared her head and brought her back to the present. With watchful eyes, Urkath told Sejuani that to continue into the lands of the Lost Ones without their leave would be a death sentence. Before Sejuani could reply, a towering figure of a man wearing a wide-horned helmet favored by the warriors of Lokfar emerged from behind her and briefly blocked out the sun. This is where the story reveals that Sejuani fought alongside Olaf for many years. Even on foot, he was easily the biggest Freljordian she had ever seen. He was as tall as she was now, riding her boar, Bristle. Some said Olaf's mother had to lay with a troll to grow so big, but none ever said it to his face. Olaf walked past them, towards the mountain and into the blizzard, as if he was on a casual stroll. A death sentence. He liked the sound of that. The story then cuts to the moment the hunters made the mammoth drop to its knees. The hunters prepared their spears, while Sejuani unlaced her mighty flail, Winter's Wrath. Steeling herself for the pain, she gripped the leather-wrapped haft and swung it around her body, feeling the deathly cold of the true ice secured at the end of the chain. Of course, if you don't remember, wielding true ice weapons comes at a cost. These weapons inflict immense pain upon its wielders, and that's if the wielders are iceborn. Those who are not iceborn just die when touching it. Urkath then drew his longsword. Its hilt worked from the jawbones of Rimefangs, and Olaf unsheathed his mighty axes, their blades glimmering with hoarfrost. Blood dripped from Olaf's lips as he chewed the inside of his cheek in anticipation. Sejuani held him back, telling him that they would do it properly, together, no heroics. Olaf grinned and nodded. Sejuani took a step forward and lifted the flail, letting the beast see the glimmering cold of its true ice. "Get up," she ordered. "You are a king of the Freljord. You don't die on your knees." The mammoth glared at her and, taking strength from her words, pushed itself up. It then loosed a ferocious bray of defiance. The sound echoed over the mountains like the Forge God's legendary Karnix, a war horn whose blast could be heard all over the world. Sejuani promised to the beast that they would give it a good death. "A glorious death," grunted Olaf, the words forced between his bloodied teeth. But Sejuani wasn't sure whose death he meant. Then the beast charged. Sejuani and Urkath dove to the side, but Olaf leapt to meet the beast with a bellow to rival that of his foe. His axe struck the mammoth in the center of its head, fingers away from going into its skull. The mammoth flicked its trunk and tossed Olaf over its back. Olaf landed on hard rocks, dangerously close to the sheer drop of the cliff. He came to his feet with a delighted lunatic laugh. Sejuani rolled to her feet and smashed her flail into the mammoth's back knee, forcing the beast to the ground. The other hunters came in with the spears, just like they had many times before. They weren't going to kill it just yet. They had to exhaust it first. But Olaf wasn't going to do that. He charged in again. He was too deep in the blood mist, which is a state of mind that turned him into a ferocious killing machine, a living avatar of death. He caught its tusk and used it to fling onto its back. He then started hacking down, despite the beast trying to shake him off. Seeing his chance, Urkath charged forward, sword raised to cut its exposed throat, but its trunk caught him around his waist. The mammoth lifted Urkath into the air, before slamming him down on a jutting black rock. Sejuani heard his spine shatter even over his screams of agony. Twice more it smashed him against the rock before hurling his body aside. Screaming, Sejuani then charged in, as Olaf continued hacking into the beast's back. Ducking under the tusks, Sejuani took the shard of true ice in her fist, her hand burning as if it was on fire, and she slammed it into the mammoth's chest. She then slid out from underneath the mammoth and dropped the shard from her blackened, numb fingers. Moments later, the mammoth staggered, its mighty heart freezing in its chest, its blood turning to ice. Sejuani then shouted at Olaf to get off of it. Her voice was powerful enough to penetrate the blood mist consuming Olaf's mind. The hunt was over. The beast had its back to the cliff. There was nowhere to go. Though the mammoth knew it was beaten, it lifted its head proudly. It had fought to the last, and Sejuani held her weapon high, honoring its spirit. The great beast stared her down, caring nothing for the gesture. Instead, it stepped back and over the cliff. Sejuani sank down to her knees and swore. Olaf just shrugged, as he leaned dangerously far over the edge. At least the beast saved them the bother of dragging its carcass off the mountain. Sejuani sighed, ready to agree with him, when she heard a distant cracking sound. The sound of breaking ice. A network of black lines spread out from where the mammoth had landed, and Sejuani realized the beast fell onto a frozen surface of a mountain lake. Moments later, it sank into the black waters, far beyond their reach. Defying all Sejuani's understanding of the human body, Urkath yet lived. His ribs were smashed, all limbs broken and his spine shattered into fragments, but he still drew breath. He gave them all a grin. and whispered that the wolf called him home. Sejuani replied that Lamb would never think to come for him. They were Winter's Claw, they wouldn't go meekly into the beyond. Urkath then asked for his sword, and Olaf pressed it into his hand. Olaf then said that the tales of his death would be told at the hearth fires for many seasons. He envied him that. Coughing blood, Urkath replied he would gladly swap places with him. "No," said Olaf sadly, "I do not think that you would." Urkath then turned his head, the light fading from his eyes. For the last gesture, Sejuani put his mask back over his face, and said that the wolf would be here soon. It would be nice if Urkath gave the old bastard a scare for her. With their prey lost, and only scraps to sustain them on their way back, there was no reason to stay on the hunt. So Sejuani rode back on Bristle, her hand wrapped in furs. Olaf kept pace with her on foot. Their mood was grim, they were exhausted and starving. Night closed in as they reached the foot of the mountains, and camped beneath a titanic stone. It had once been a part of a great stone circle higher up in the mountains, but it had toppled in a long ago earthquake. The smooth stone surface was carved with ancient symbols no one could read. A pair of frozen skeletons lay entwined at its far end, a frosted blade lying within their bones. Lovers or bitter enemies, who could say? The next day they continued their travels, which took them past the remains of a village in the mountain pass. Its structures were ghastly tombs now, its inhabitants dead or long gone. Nightfall of the second day saw them come within the sight of the Winter's Claw encampment. That's where Sejuani got a moment to reflect on how few they were now. Not so very long ago, when she had first marshaled her followers, they numbered in thousands. But hunger and the harshness of the recent seasons forced her to scatter the host. "How do you fare?" asked Olaf, the first words he had said since coming off of the mountain. "At last he speaks," said Sejuani, irritated at his sullenness. Olaf told her to not mind him. Every time the blood mistook him, he hoped it would be the last, that he would finally die in glory. But every time it faded, he was sad that he was one step closer to dying in peace. Sejuani shrugged. They had enemies all around them, so she promised him days of blood and battle, nights of death and fury. Olaf grinned, asking, "You swear it?" "I swear it," she promised. She then added that Vilhjalmur might see it as an ill omen for the tribe leader to return empty-handed. Olaf replied that he would spit on his kind. Seers only spoke in riddles and delivered grim potence. He would sooner trust a southerner. Sensing an opening, Sejuani then asked him if he was ever going to tell her why he went south. "No," Olaf answered. "I don't think I will. Some tales are best left in the past." The story then cuts to the moment they entered the Winter's Claw camp. As she had predicted, Vilhjalmur wasn't happy to see Sejuani without meat for curing. With his cloak of raven feathers, he circled the fire pit and gathered the claw leaders, telling them the coming winter would be the grimmest any of them had known. Olaf openly mocked him, telling him a child could see the same thing. The other claw hunters were a bit more successful. Svaljek's claw had taken 6 Elnuk from the Avarosans, and Hefnar's group killed a small group of horned seals. It wasn't nearly enough, but it would keep them fed for at least a few days. Still, while everyone feared for their survival, nobody knew the answer to how to survive till the next spring. Some thought they should march south and make peace with the Avarosans. Others believed they should carve a red path through the Avarosan territories to earn a glorious death. Sejuani had to admit, despite her not liking the idea of a one-way trip south, she liked the idea of a glorious battle. It was better than dispersing the tribe to allow smaller groups to survive on their own. Had she done that, the chances of everyone reuniting during the spring were small. People would rather start a new life in the south. But that was not the Winter's Claw way. She would never become a prisoner of fields and stone houses. In the end, it was Vilhjalmur who had stepped forward and asked how were the Winter's Claw to survive. Once Sejuani would have struck him down for threatening her authority, but in that moment, the question was real. and her people needed a leader that could make life and death decisions without fear. There was a storm in Sejuani's head as she tried to think of solutions. But that storm calmed down when she started brushing the thick hair of Bristle's back. Grooming the giant beast always soothed her. She thought back to the simpler times, when she had brought Ashe to the Winter's Claw after finding her alone and exiled. She smiled when she remembered how Ashe mistook her for an Ursine. Her strokes grew harder when she remembered how Ashe betrayed them and turned her back on Sejuani. That's when Sejuani knew they could never make peace with the other Rosens. Bristle grunted in annoyance, stamping his hoofs in irritation. "Careful, lass, the beast's getting unsettled," said a voice from behind Sejuani. She spun, reached for the knife at her hip, and then, just as quickly, she released it, shocked to see who had spoken. Lying in a makeshift bed of straw was a wretched old man who should have been left out on the ice to die many years ago. His legs were stumps that ended just above the knee, and his sightless eyes were mottled white. His name was Krieg, and he had once been a seer of all Gvana's tribe, farmers and builders who would refuse the call to Sejuani's banner. So she had sent Urkath's Warclaw to wipe them out and take their herds, their furs, their iron, and their salt. The survivors fled up the slopes of a mountain, whose summit seethed with the red rock that flows. When Urkath returned, it was with Krieg on his back, and he'd seemed confused when Sejuani demanded to know why he had brought them a useless mouth to feed. Urkath claimed the Ursine had driven them from the mountain, speaking of blade-pierced titans, draped in bloodied fur and horns, gaping skulls and fists that hurled fire. He had simply said the mountain had told him to bring the blind man, before dumping him unceremoniously at the edge of the village. Sejuani had given orders that no one feed the seer, that he be left behind for the Freljord to take. But here he was, many months and leagues from that battle, alive and, more confusingly, somehow still with the Winter's Claw. At this point, many of you will probably have no idea who Krieg is. Only those who have a really good memory. But wait till the end of this video. You'll see how everything snaps in place. Krieg then spoke to Sejuani, telling her that the word was that she had glimpsed the realm of the Lost Ones in the mountain. He too had seen them before. It was when Sejuani drove them into Hearthhome. After a pause, Sejuani finally snapped back at him, telling him he didn't see anything. He was blind. Krieg told her that he did see them nonetheless. White and gold in the clouds, lightning for blood, and voices of thunder. Sejuani peered into his milky eyes and told him those eyes haven't seen anything in many years. Krieg agreed. He went blind when he was 10 years old. But some things were best seen without eyes. Just like a warrior can still feel cold in their hands after losing them, Krieg could still sense with his eyes. And he saw more than he ever wished to see. Things people would gouge their own eyes out if they saw the half of them. Sejuani replied that he didn't know the things she saw. Again, Krieg agreed. But then he continued. Ever since that night you and your spirit walker made offerings to the Lost Ones, you sang the oaths, you burned the wood in the Death Knot, and offered up the weapons and bone. So what do you see? Days of blood and battle? Nights of death and fury? Just thinking about the slaughter at the city by the river filled Sejuani with the hunger for raw meat. But she quickly shook the thought away, asking Krieg, how was he still alive? Her people left him behind. No one gave him food. Old Orn fed me, said Krieg, at Hearthhome, just before your killers came out of the smoke, lifted me up like a babe, and nourished me with a mouthful of broth from his great cauldron. That he did, yes. Sejuani sighed. Krieg was clearly mad, and someone had to be feeding him in secret. But Krieg interrupted her thought. He swore that ever since he was brought here, no food and no water had touched his lips. It was all because of Orn's cauldron. Nobody who sips from it ever leaves unsatisfied. One mouthful, and her belly wouldn't growl for a year. As wise as Krieg looked in that moment, Sejuani still scoffed. Orn's cauldron was just a legend, wishful thinking, a tale for the children. Krieg snapped back at her. Tales came from the truth. He lifted the furs covering his body and shouted at her if this looked like wishful thinking to her. Sejuani gasped at the sight of Krieg's torso. His flesh ruddy and pink, his belly full and soft with fat, while she was pale, her skin gripping to her bones. Sejuani couldn't understand what she saw, so Krieg continued. As he told her, it was the great cauldron of Orn. The Lost One stole it from Hearthhome, saying Orn was too soft on mortals, that he was spoiling them by allowing them to fill their bellies anytime they wanted. They were getting weak because of that. But Orn was crafty, and his magic couldn't be hidden. So after the Ursine took it to their own mountain, the skies above them started glowing bright red. Krieg then told Sejuani to ask her shaman. He would know it was the truth. Unfortunately, Sejuani replied that Udyr was gone. He walked into the blizzard, saying he needed some time away from the spirits looking to get inside him. So Krieg continued that it was her own decision then. What would it be? The old ways? Frozen on their knees in the blood-soaked snow? Or maybe they would try to take back what the Lost One stole. They had fought them before, so what was one more time? Sejuani had a moment of reflection on the situation, before she asked him, "Why would you help me? The Winter's Claw slew his tribe." Krieg replied that she didn't understand yet. They were all one tribe, and it was long past the time she understood that. She was thinking small, like a fighter only seeing the foe in front of her. She had to start thinking like a war mother, like a queen. There is a season for fighting, for leading, and for dying. But the time was coming for the sons and daughters of the Freljord to stand together, or to die alone, one by one. The following morning, people had gathered to listen to Sejuani's instructions. As Sejuani walked toward the crowd, she marched past Olaf. She told him that she knew what they had to do, but no one would like it. Olaf shrugged, telling her she was War Mother. They didn't need to like it, they would do what she told them to do. That's how things worked. Sejuani replied that she wanted Olaf at her side. Olaf rose to his full towering height, hooking his axe over his shoulder. "No," said Sejuani, blade out. Olaf slowly nodded and said, "You going to tell me your plan before we go in? Remember how I promised you days of blood and battle, nights of death and fury?" "Aye, War Mother, I do," said Olaf, his smile as wide as the horizon. "We're going back up the mountain," said Sejuani, "to the realm of the Ursine to steal the great cauldron of Orn from the Volibear." "You're right, they are not going to like it," said Olaf, "but I love it." And that was the story Dead of Winter. As you can see, this is just one massive teaser for a future event in the Freljord. There are just so many things coming together. There is this massive winter approaching, while Sejuani learned that maybe she should be banding together with the other leaders of the Freljord, while at the same time, if you don't remember, Lysandra is also preparing for something big. So I wouldn't be surprised if all of this was heading towards one point, where Lysandra, Ashe and Sejuani meet, just like the ancient three sisters of the Freljord. But more than that, in this story, we learned that Sejuani is marching towards Volibear. She is going to face him to take back Orn's cauldron. Now, in this story, there was the big reveal that Krieg is still alive. But most of you will have no idea who Krieg is. That's because, back when we covered this story, my channel was relatively small. The original story comes from 2017. It's a story called The Voice from the Hearth. This is where blind, legless Krieg appeared for the first time. In that story, a group of Freljordians, led by Olgvana, who was also mentioned in this story, was driven into the half-mountain of Old Orn by the Winter's Claw. And there they witnessed Orn fighting back the Ursine. And he even fought the Thousand-Pierced Bear. Originally, we thought that Orn was fighting them back to protect the mortals, which he was doing that anyway, but here we learned that the Ursine invaded his home to steal his cauldron. The group thought they would die that night, but they woke up the following morning, after the fight was over. and they continued running from the Winter's Claw. That story is 4 years old now, and we do have a video on it. Just be careful, it is from 2017. It may be awkward. My voice was awful back then, but it is still amazing to see such a great connection. Not to mention the fact that Udyr is getting a VGU, so the reason for him to leave Sejuani might be so that he comes back later on, and that gives him a canonical reason for the change of his appearance. So now I wonder, will we actually see Sejuani facing the Ursine? And will this mean that Olaf will appear in a cinematic as well? I mean, in this story, it was teased that Olaf had some reason to come south and return to the Winter's Claw. He just refused to tell us the reason. So now I wonder, did this actually retcon Olaf joining the Sentinels of Light? Because if so, hell yeah!